All right, wonderful. Okay. So let's go over the agenda quickly. So this training is, of course, on the definition of. And so the first thing we're going to do is talk about the federal rule and its background. This rule has a fairly interesting history and background, and I feel that it's relevant to understand that background to get an idea of how we arrived where we are today. Of course, we'll talk about what the rule does. We'll go into detail about each piece of the rule, including how Oregon adoption differs from the federal rule. And this is key. I'm going to be emphasizing this throughout the training, that the way in which Oregon adopted this rule is different than the federal rule. If you take nothing else away from this training, I hope it's that. I will also share resources. And again, I just want to remind you, be aware that most of these resources are based on the federal version of the rule. And so just take that into consideration when you are using resources made available by EPA, for example, that they're going to be based on the federal rule. So you'll need to have in the back of your mind the way in which Oregon has adopted this rule. And I have some tools for you to help make that a little bit easier. We'll take a short break, and then when we come back, again, we'll have time for questions and discussions, and Jay and Zeb are here to help field your questions. And Jay and Zeb, I hope the two of you will jump in at any point while I'm speaking and elaborate on what I'm saying or correct me if I misspeak or just provide more information. And again, everyone, please feel free to interrupt me as I am presenting to ask clarifying questions, and save more involved questions or discussion for the latter part of this training. So before we dive in, are there any just questions or comments about the layout of the training? Anything that's unclear before we keep going? Okay, awesome. So let's move on to slide 3. And I have a question for all of you. This is just something to ponder. If you would like to answer the question, you can drop an answer into the chat. Why is the definition of solid waste important? Now, this is the name of this rule, definition of solid waste. Why is it important that we clearly define solid waste? And again, you can just take a few minutes to ponder that. This is really the key question here for us is, why is this important? How does this impact what we do as regulators and generators of hazardous waste? Okay, let's move on to slide 4. Just keep that question in mind. So let's talk about EPA's definition of solid waste rule. The amendments to the definition of solid waste rule define several new terms, including hazardous secondary material, hazardous secondary material generator, and sham recycling. And of course, we'll cover each of these terms and definitions in detail. This rule also includes exclusions for hazardous secondary materials that are legitimately recycled. More on that shortly. The rule amendments also enhance regulation over speculative accumulation and add new legitimacy criteria to ensure all hazardous waste recycling is protectively managed and adequately documented. And that is a mouthful, and again, we'll break that down and talk about it in detail. The rule also updates the definitions of facility and contained to tie them to hazardous secondary material generation management, as well as variance rules for non-waste determinations. So as you can see, there's a lot in this rule. It's pretty broad. So we're going to cover each of these things in detail. And again, if I can ask folks to please mute themselves, we have some background noise, and that's going to show up in the recording. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please, Deb. Thank you. So this table is from an EPA source. I have it linked down there in the bottom right corner of the slide. It's from an EPA document entitled Implementation of DSW Exclusion. I highly, highly recommend taking a look at that document. It was incredibly helpful for me to read it, to understand the history of this rule and how we got to where we are today. So what you're seeing in this table here are the two different versions of the hazardous secondary material exclusion. There's a 2015 version, verified recycler exclusion, and a 2018 transfer-based exclusion. And this table is showing what each of those versions mean to different entities. So you've got on the left-hand side there, generator, intermediate and reclamation facility, and export, and how these two different versions of this particular exclusion impact those entities. So this is, like I said, a really good summary of these two exclusions. It's in this EPA document if you would like to read more about it. And the definition of solid waste rule has a long history. It's not just these two exclusion versions from 2015 and 2018. Actually go all the way back to 2008. That's when the original version of the exclusion for recycled hazardous secondary material was promulgated. And that version is now known as the 2008 transfer-based exclusion, just to make this a little bit more complicated. And then in 2015, the verified recycler exclusion came out. And then in 2018, the transfer-based exclusion. So this is all just to say that this rule has shape-shifted over the years and does not look the same as it did in the early 2000s. Let's go to the next slide. It's a little bit more background to share with you. So this is an adoption map for this rule. And EPA puts out these adoption maps. They're really very handy if you're wondering what the status of a particular rule is in another state. You can go look at these maps that EPA publishes, and they update them fairly frequently. I pulled this particular map in April of this year, so there may be some updates to this map by now. They'd be fairly minimal if so. But what I wanted to share with you with this map is take a second to take in how colorful this map really is. So you can see down in the key, there are so many different ways that a state may have adopted this rule. And some states still have not adopted this rule. We just have such a variety of the way in which states have decided to adopt definition of solid waste. And that's really just the key takeaway I wanted to give you here, is that it's not consistent across the United States, the way in which definition of solid waste has been adopted. So that just adds another layer of complication. The rule itself already has a complex history, and then you add to that the way in which states have chosen to adopt this rule also varies widely. So what this leaves us with is a very complex national landscape for definition of solid waste rule. Okay, so let's now focus in on Oregon and talk about the way in which we adopted this rule. Thanks, Eb. So let's talk about the modifications that we've made to this rule. Hey, Zeb, will you do me a favor and mute everyone? Thank you.
Yep, if I do, it's probably going to mute you too, Ellie.
That's okay, I'll unmute myself.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Eb. All right, so again, we were talking about Oregon-only modifications, and we're going to start with
You're muted, Ellie.
All right, let's talk about Oregon-only modifications, exclusions. So we adopted the 2015 version of definition of solid waste as modified by the 2018 U.S. Court of Appeals decision. Now, if you're wondering, what does that mean? I say, don't sweat it too much. The thing to know is that the biggest difference between the federal rule and the Oregon version of this rule is that we did not adopt an exclusion for recycled hazardous secondary materials. Now, I'm going to say it again because it's very important, and it's the biggest difference between the federal rule and the Oregon version of the rule. We did not adopt an exclusion for recycled hazardous secondary materials. So we did not adopt the 2015 verified recycler exclusion or the 2018 transfer-based exclusion. Did not adopt those. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And this is a table, again, from that EPA document that I highly recommend everyone read. Again, it's linked down in the lower right-hand corner, so you don't need to go searching for it. It'll be right in this PowerPoint for you. So this table, I feel, is very straightforward and does a good job explaining the ways in which states may have adopted the exclusions for hazardous secondary materials. And it also shows you that interstate regulation is pretty complicated when it comes to this rule. So luckily for us, our situation is the most straightforward. We did not adopt any of the exclusions, so the exclusions never apply. So what this means is that if we send materials out of our state, out of Oregon, hazardous secondary materials, they're hazardous waste. If they come into the state, they're hazardous waste. So as I said, the most straightforward situation is what we have here in Oregon. And if you're curious about how these exclusions might interact in different states where the scenario is different, this is a really good tool to use. So again, this table's in that EPA document. It's linked in the lower right-hand corner. It's a really excellent resource. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, and let's get into these definitions. And again, remember, if I'm going too quickly or if something's not making sense and you need some clarification, just feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Okay, so let's talk about hazardous secondary material definition. So it's important to understand that there's a distinction between the definition and the exclusion for hazardous secondary materials. Again, as I stated, we have not adopted any new exclusions for hazardous secondary materials, but we have adopted this definition. So why adopt this definition or any definition related to hazardous secondary materials if we didn't adopt the exclusion? Fair question. So the reason is because adoption of this and other definitions was necessary for us to create a class of materials subject to new and more protective regulations. And I will definitely get into what those are as we move through this training. So, as I stated, we have not adopted any new hazardous secondary material exclusions, but the pre-existing exclusions still apply. And hazardous secondary material requirements now apply to these exclusions, these pre-existing exclusions. And I'm definitely going to explain more about this as we move through the training. But the main takeaway here is that you've got hazardous secondary material definition, otherwise known as HSM for short. We adopted the definition and other definitions that are related to HSM. And those are separate from the new exclusions for HSM, which we did not adopt. All right, let's move on to the definition of hazardous secondary material generator. So this means any person whose act or process produces hazardous secondary materials at the generating facility. So this could really be anyone, just as anyone can be a hazardous waste generator, just about anyone can be a hazardous secondary material generator. And like the definition of HSM itself, it's important to note that this definition is distinct from the exclusion of these materials from regulation under RCRA. So again, we adopted this definition to align Oregon rule with the federal rule so we could be working with the same vocabulary as the federal rule. And it also provides us the authority to implement and enforce HSM recycling standards and regulations for the management of HSM, again, under those pre-existing exclusions and exemptions. So in other words, adopting these definitions for HSM and HSM Generator, it has secured our regulatory authority for speculative accumulation, HSM container management, sham recycling, and the legitimacy criteria. And we will cover what each of these things means in detail as we move through this training. Okay, so another question for you. This is just something to ponder. Keep in the back of your mind. You can answer in the chat if you'd like. 2 questions. Question number 1 is, what are we looking at here? What is this and why is it important? And if you've spent a fair amount of time with RCRA, you're probably familiar with this table. You've probably seen it before. So what we're looking at here is actually just table 1 from the Hazardous Waste Federal Regulations. This is table 1 in Hazardous Waste RCRA. So this is also known as the table with the asterisks. If you've taken McCoy training, you've probably heard it called that. So this table is very important in RCRA, right? So what is this table? It shows us how materials can be excluded from regulation, right? So this table still exists. It's still applicable even after our adoption of definition of solid waste. Our adoption of this rule has made no changes to this table and the exemptions that it provides. All of these exemptions, they still exist, they're still applicable. We just haven't adopted any new exemptions for hazardous secondary materials, but all of these that you see on this table, they still apply, they're still out there. So what's interesting is that we have adopted new legitimacy criteria. Thanks, Deb. And these new legitimacy criteria, they apply to that table I just showed you in the previous slide. So this is new. These legitimacy criteria, these are new. There are 4 factors. And this rule says that in order for hazardous secondary materials to be legitimately recycled, they have to meet the 4 factors of legitimate recycling. So I'll go over those now. And the first is that legitimate recycling must involve a hazardous secondary material that provides a useful contribution to a recycling process or to the recycled product or an intermediate of the recycling process. 2, the recycling process must produce a valuable product or intermediate. 3, the generator and the recycler must manage the hazardous secondary material as a valuable commodity when it is under their control. And 4, the product of the recycling process is analogous or comparable to a legitimate product or intermediate product. And additionally, there are records requirements. So you need records documenting compliance with these criteria, and they must be made available for DEQ review for 3 years after the recycling activity ends. So this is a lot, these legitimacy criteria, and you might be wondering, okay, that's great. So how do I know if what I'm doing meets the legitimacy criteria? Is there any help there? Yes, we've got some help for you. So EPA released a template in December of 2022, which we adapted for use in Oregon. There's no specific format required for this documentation. The rule does not state how you need to record this information. It just states that you need to do the legitimacy criteria determination and have a record of that, keep it for 3 years, and be able to show it to DEQ if we ask for it. So this isn't something that you need to submit to us unless it's requested. So it's a good idea to do it, to have it there available if you are asked for it, but it's not something that you need to do and then send to us unless we ask. So I highlighted this sentence here. This template can also be used to document a claim of legitimate recycling under any other recycling exclusion or exemption. And this is from the EPA version of this template. So if you recall, We didn't adopt those new HSM exclusions, which is what is listed here for CFR section 261.4. That's what EPA is referring to there. But then they say you can go ahead and use this template to document legitimate recycling under any other exclusion or exemption. So what they're talking about there is all that good stuff that's in table 1, the table with the asterisks. This can be used for that. So it's like, all right, great. That's very straightforward. So let's go ahead and make an Oregon version, and we can share that with our generators. And I have a link to that form right here in this slide where it says it can be found here. If you click on that, what it's going to take you to is a fillable PDF. And that fillable PDF walks you through each of those legitimacy criteria requirements, 1 through 4, and asks you specific questions. And you can go through that template and look at the legitimacy criteria, check the boxes next to the questions where it asks you, is this material a valuable commodity? How are you managing this material? And it'll walk you through the process. And then you can keep that for yourself at your site, have it available for our folks, our DEQ folks, if they ask you for it. And if you get hung up going through the legitimacy criteria documentation, please reach out, contact us. We can help you with that because it is very crucial that you have that documentation and that you have gone through that process. Okay, let's keep going. Thanks, Deb. So I'm going to say this is where it gets complicated, and you're probably thinking, "What? It was already complicated." This is where it really gets complicated. Okay, so let's talk about hazardous secondary material management. So these materials have specific management regulations, including a prohibition on speculative accumulation, and there's new requirements for storage and tracking to document that HSM is not accumulated speculatively. Documentation, documentation, documentation. This rule is very heavy on having that documentation. Speculative accumulation requirements were developed to ensure recycling is legitimate and that hazardous secondary material generators don't avoid the requirement to protectively manage this material. So hazardous secondary material is not accumulated speculatively if it is recyclable under the existing exemptions and exclusions, meaning table 1, it meets the legitimacy criteria, which we just discussed. It is stored protectively according to the rule, and the generator is able to show during the calendar year the amount of material recycled or transferred to a different site for recycling equals at least 75% by weight or volume of the material accumulated. And that is really key. So documentation, keeping track of things, writing all this stuff down, this is very, very important because you're going to need to show that 75% is being met in order to show that you are not accumulating speculatively. So in addition, materials must be managed in labeled storage units and the accumulation dates tracked on the label itself, or you can use an inventory log or some other appropriate method. The rule was not specific about what method you need to use to track your accumulation dates, just that you absolutely need to do that. So materials have to be managed in labeled storage units, and you've got to be tracking your accumulation date, either on the labels itself or through an inventory log or whatever other method you might use at your facility. Also to note, processes involving hazardous secondary materials being returned to the original process via pipes are not considered to accumulate. So that's an important distinction. If you've got materials going back into the original process via pipes, there's technically no accumulation. Won't apply to every situation, but if it applies to you, you probably know who you are, and that is a good thing. Okay, ideally, the revised rule enables inspectors to more accurately determine the accumulation time associated with HSM, making it easier to determine if there's a speculative accumulation violation. So this is part of what has changed in this rule, is really, really hammering on making sure that you're tracking, that you're not speculatively accumulating, and that you've got the documentation to show your compliance inspector, hey, I am not accumulating speculatively, I'm managing my materials properly, here is all my documentation showing that, here's how we've been tracking, we're adhering to the 75% requirement, all those good things. Okay, let's move on and talk about another way in which Oregon has modified this rule. And I mentioned this up top, so now I want to get into the details. So I mentioned that this rule modified the definition of contained. And in Oregon, when we adopted this rule, we modified that definition further. And the reason that we did that was to meet pre-existing state requirements. So we already have some requirements around what it means for material to be contained. And we wanted those requirements to align with the new requirements in this rule. So here's how we have changed that definition. The federal definition allows management in land-based units. Oregon does not allow management in land-based units. That is the key difference. And so what you're looking at here on this slide is the Oregon administrative rule. That's the number. And I've linked it. So if you get these, when you get these slides, you can click on that link. It'll take you straight to the rule. And those are our hazardous waste definitions for Oregon. And under G, it will say contained means stored in a container, tank, or containment building in compliance with the generator standards of 40 CFR 262 or at a permitted TSDF. So again, what this means is that we can't store material in land-based units unless you're a TSDF, unless you are a transfer disposal facility. So if you're just a generator of hazardous waste, you have no interest in being a TSDF, you're not a TSDF, no land-based units.
Ellie,
Okay.
we've got 2 questions.
Okay.
Someone asked for some basics on speculative accumulation.
Oh, good question. Yeah, let's talk about that. So what speculative accumulation means is that you are accumulating material with the intention of having it be recycled legitimately. But it's speculative if you have not secured a recycler. So if you are saying to yourself, hey, I think we can recycle this material, but you have not done the research, you don't know where you're sending it to, you don't know if there's a market for that material, you're speculating that it can be recycled. You are setting it aside with the idea that you'll recycle it, but without a plan. Jay, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, if Zeb, since well, if the inspectors come out and it's it's the second year and turns out really none of that stuff, it's waste and it hasn't been recycled and it's sitting there, you're accumulating it speculatively, and at that point, Ellie will discuss the sham recycling rules. And if you're sham recycling, if you're not really getting after it, if even with the best of intentions, it's just sitting there at the end of, say, a couple of years, we're going to come out an inspection and ask, well, what's up with this? Like, oops, you know what? You're storing hazardous waste. You've been storing hazardous waste for some time. Then we could cite all sorts of rules, and then we'll ask you to go back and pay fees on it, and we might even bring up the nasty, are you a treatment, storage, and disposal facility of hazardous waste because you're storing this hazardous waste beyond the 180 days for SQGs or 90 days for LQGs without without getting it off site. We also have a question. What is a land-based unit?
Excellent question. Very basic question. I love it. Thank you. This is exactly why I wanted people to stop me. So a land-based unit essentially means a pile on the ground. That's the simplest way to put it. It means managing things in piles, and that's why we only allow that at a transfer, storage, or disposal facility where they are set up to manage things in such a way right on the land. So it's basically what it sounds like. Yeah, a pile that's just sitting on the land. Jay, you want to add anything to that?
I don't know, Zeb, if you want to take any of these questions, but we'll hop in. But the way it's explained in the trainings is that a land-based unit it's a tank if it'll stand alone, and then there's all sorts of hazardous waste tank requirements. But if it won't, if it's earthen, so a sludge pond, which we don't allow in Oregon, haven't allowed ever since RCRA came in to this state, then it's a land-based unit. In other words, you're putting this stuff in something that is not its own standalone tank. That's a land-based unit. Piles, sludge ponds, anything that's not a tank or container or containment building.
Thanks.
A hazardous waste landfill is a land-based unit.
Yes, that's the classic example. A landfill is a land-based unit.
But you need a permit for that.
Yes, absolutely.
Good questions.
Yeah, excellent questions. Thanks, folks. Okay, let's keep going. Thanks, Seb. All right, let's talk a little bit more about some other modifications that we made in Oregon when we adopted this rule. So this was a modification that we made to hazardous secondary material management. And this is related to the legitimacy criteria, which we covered a few slides back. And again, I've inserted links into this slide so you can go directly to the Oregon administrative rule and take a look at the language. But I pulled out the pertinent parts of the language here just to show you. So what you see on this slide, this block of text here, this block of text here is from the 40 CFR, and the part that is crossed out there in the middle, that's what our state rule takes out of this definition. It pulls that part right out of the definition. So the way that this part of the rule reads in Oregon is just the bold text there. So in other words, in Oregon, this reads, the generator and the recycler must manage the hazardous secondary material as a valuable commodity when it is under their control, period. And then we go down to the hazardous secondary material must be contained, and we just discussed how we have modified the definition of contained, no land-based units. Hazardous secondary materials that are released to the environment and are not recovered immediately are discarded. So we pulled out the middle part of this definition here of the federal requirements, the part where it talks about an analogous raw material, that it must be managed at a minimum. We took all of that stuff out. So what this does effectively is make this requirement more stringent, more strict than the federal requirement. And again, we did this to fit in with our pre-existing state requirements so that these requirements weren't in conflict with one another, because you can tell this rule is already complicated. And we did not want to adopt anything that would be contradictory to the rules we already have on the books in Oregon. So that's why we made this modification. Oh, someone's asking about the definition of immediately. This question comes up quite a bit, and we ask, EPA has been asked for guidance several times on what immediately means, and typically, and of course, my inspectors jump in here if what I'm saying is not is not appropriate, but typically immediately means within 24 hours, as soon as possible. That's typically what immediately is interpreted to mean. Okay, let's talk about the definition of sham recycling. And so Jay mentioned this just a few minutes ago, and this is very important concept when talking about legitimate recycling. So sham recycling is what happens when a recycler doesn't adhere to legitimacy criteria. So you could say that sham recycling is the opposite of legitimate recycling. So sham recycling is defined in the federal rule. I have the citation right there for you all. Again, you can click on that hyperlink and it'll take you right there so you can read the whole thing. So why is it important to define sham recycling? I just said it's the inverse of legitimate recycling, so why not just leave it at that? Fair question. Clearly defining what constitutes legitimate versus sham recycling helps you all, the regulated community, with your compliance efforts. It makes it very clear, this is what is legitimate recycling, this is what is sham recycling, so that you know exactly what is expected and how to adhere to those requirements. And EPA has done a really good job of putting together some materials about sham recycling, and you can find those in the resources that I have for you. There's a resources slide in this presentation, and you'll find links there. Okay, so sham recycling may include situations when a secondary material is ineffective or only marginally effective for its claimed use, used in excess of the amount necessary, has hazardous constituents along for the ride, or is handled in a manner inconsistent with its use as a raw material or commercial product substitute. So that's the definition. That's a lot. Let's talk about what that might actually look like, right? So I'm going to talk you through some examples of sham recycling to hopefully make this more concrete. Okay, so let's talk about that requirement where it's ineffective or only marginally effective for its claimed use. What does that mean? What's an example of that? Here's an example. Using certain heavy metal sludges in concrete when they don't contribute any significant benefit to the concrete's properties. So that's an example of the use of hazardous secondary material that's ineffective or only marginally effective for its claimed use. So what about hazardous secondary material used in excess of the amount necessary? Well, an example might be using materials containing chlorine as an ingredient in a process that requires chlorine, but using it in excess of the amount that's actually required. That would be considered sham recycling. So, okay, what about the requirement that HSM be handled in a manner consistent with its use as a raw material or commercial product substitute? What's an example of that? An example would be storing material in a surface impoundment or a pond, so a land-based unit, as we had discussed before, as compared to a tank in good condition that's designed for storing that material. Okay, so what about the end recycled product is not comparable to a product made from an analogous raw material? What would an example of that be? Well, let's say producing a product with a higher concentration of hazardous constituents than would be normally found in a product made from raw materials. So in that case, the end recycled product isn't comparable to a product that would be made from raw materials because it's got a higher concentration of hazardous constituents along for the ride. Okay, let's keep going, Zeb. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is where we take a bit of a hard left and talk about something completely different than what we've been talking about previously. So this is part of this rule. Definition of solid waste provides a new variance option for generators. So a variance is a waiver from specific regulatory or statutory requirements. And definition of solid waste establishes additional requirements for non-waste determination variances. So this includes requiring facilities to reapply in the event of a change in process or materials, re-notify every year with updated information. This is an Oregon only requirement, by the way. The federal requirement is every 2 years. But since we do annual reporting in Oregon, we have changed this to a yearly notification. And petitioners must demonstrate why the existing solid waste exclusions would not apply. So again, recall table 1, the table with the asterisks. If you're seeking a variance, a non-waste variance, you must demonstrate why those existing exclusions don't apply to your particular situation. Under this new process, a generator could apply for a non-waste determination variance within a limited set of categories. And definition of solid waste includes additional variance process requirements, including a 10-year review and approval cycle for all variances issued under this rule adoption. So this doesn't apply to variances that have already been granted. This is going forward. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So this is a little bit more on variance reporting. These are the Oregon-only modifications that have been made to variance reporting. I already mentioned one of them, which was to report to us every year. That's basically the only change that we've made. I just wanted to mention it here because, again, if you're looking at any kind of federal guidance on this rule, you're going to see that it tells you to report to EPA biennially. That is not the case in Oregon. You would report to us annually and not EPA biennially. And that's all that this rule is saying here, is that you report to us annually and not EPA biennially. And again, as I noted, variances that are issued prior to rule promulgation are grandfathered. So these new requirements don't apply to variances that were issued prior to January 1 of 2023. Okay, next slide. All right, this is one of those resources that I mentioned up top. So this is a crosswalk table that we developed. This is also in our definition of solid waste fact sheet. You can find it there as well as here in this PowerPoint presentation. And so this table shows you the regulations that are related to definition of solid waste rule. It provides the federal citation and then the OAR, Oregon Administrative Rule citation. So if you are using any of those federal resources that are provided here in this presentation, or you find out there on the web, this is a really good table to have with you as you're reading through those resources, because you can stop and reference this table and say, how was this adopted in Oregon, or was this even adopted in Oregon? So right here at the top, again, we've got those new HSM exclusions, the verified recycler transfer-based exports are included in there as well. Again, we didn't adopt those, so they're excluded, and they are specifically excluded in Oregon Administrative Rule, and the citation is there for you. Speculative accumulation and HSM management were adopted in Oregon. No changes made to those, and I've given you the rule where those were adopted, the Oregon Administrative Rule. And then here's just another example. The legitimacy criteria were adopted, but we modified them. And again, the citation is there as to where we modified the legitimacy criteria. So highly recommend that you have this table somewhere handy when you are reading through materials related to definition of solid waste. It's going to save you a lot of time, hopefully a lot of trouble, so you know exactly where to find these references and understand how this rule, how definition of solid waste is different in Oregon than it is at the federal level. Okay, and then this is the slide of resources that I have mentioned. So these are all hyperlinked for you. Most of these are federal resources. One of them is from McCoy and Associates. And again, these are all going to be referencing the federal version of the rule, so that cheat sheet table that was on the previous slide is a good thing to keep handy. The last two bullet points here are DEQ resources, so they will be Oregon specific. One of them is an overview fact sheet for definition of solid waste, and that table that I showed you, the crosswalk table, it's in that fact sheet as well. And also previously mentioned the documentation of legitimate recycling form, that fillable PDF, it is linked there for you as well. So let's go forward, just one more slide. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to take a break here for a few minutes. It looks like we're right on time, which is excellent, and wanted to stop right at around 11. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we will answer your questions or talk about anything that you folks would like to discuss related to definition of solid waste. So it's 11 a.m. right now. Let's come back at 11:10 and we will pick up. Thank you so much.